Thank you to the board for inviting me to serve you this morning and to try to address some of the issues through an examination of our history. And the title of my talk is A History of Ecclesiastical Supervision in the LCMS. Introduction. When you hear the term ecclesiastical supervision, you're probably going to think of its most prominent manifestation, that is bishops, district presidents, and their kin. My paper will deal with bishops and their kin, but also with the broader subject matter implied by the term ecclesiastical supervision. Therefore, we first need a definition of that term. The term ecclesiastical means things having to do with the church. Supervision is well known to us from the secular world. We have supervisors and supervision in every sort of business, government function, and nonprofit institution. Supervision, the word, is a compound of the Latin super, which means over or above, and the Latin visio or visio, which means to see or view. The Greek New Testament term for bishop, that is episkopos, has the same meaning and is often translated as overseer in English. Although supervision can take place in any number of ways, it implies the notion of viewing from an elevated position. Ecclesiastical supervisors thus view their subordinates and their activities from a position of higher rank and authority. Are Lutheran pastors supervisors? Before we can explore the history of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod on this topic, we first need to ask whether all Lutherans have understood that parish pastors have ecclesiastical supervision. And the quick answer is yes. Parish pastors supervise what goes on in their parish to a greater or lesser degree. Unlike the Roman Catholics and the Anglicans, who believe that the distinction between bishops and pastors is divinely ordained, Lutherans believe that the traditional Catholic distinction is a man-made one. It is thus proper for Lutherans to say every pastor is a bishop. We don't usually do that, but you could. To prove this point, I first quote from the Treatise of the Power and Primacy of the Pope in the Book of Concord, which states, Jerome then teaches that the distinction of degree between bishop and presbyter or pastor are established by human authority. Since the distinction of rank between bishop and pastor is not by divine right, it is clear that an ordination performed by a pastor in his own church is valid by divine right. End of quote. The Lutheran Orthodox theologian Johann Gerhard discussed the biblical and patristic justification for this Lutheran position as follows. I quote, "From the statements of Scripture that mention bishops and presbyters, one can draw the obvious conclusions that in the apostolic church, the same men were called bishops and presbyters. Paul calls the presbyters of the church of Ephesus bishops, Acts 20:28. In the inscription of the epistle to the Philippians, he understands presbyters under the name bishops, Philippians 1:1. Whatever virtues he requires in a bishop, he teaches that the same virtues are to be sought in presbyters, 1 Timothy 3:1. And he points out that he left Titus in Crete for this purpose to establish presbyters in every city, Titus 1:5, which he later calls bishops, verse 7. Therefore, according to the nomenclature of the apostles, the same one who is a presbyter is correctly called a bishop. Jerome, commentary on Titus 1, he quotes, "He who is a bishop is a presbyter. This is so obvious that Cardinal Robert Bellarmine was forced to admit in the treatise De Clericus, quote, at the time of the apostles, the names bishops and presbyter were common to all priests. both to the greater ones whom we call bishops today and to the lesser ones whom we call presbyters." End of quote. The supervision of Lutheran churches in the 16th century. The Lutheran idea that the distinction between bishops and pastors is man-made and thus not mandated by God led to a significant restructuring of the Lutheran churches in the 16th century. Although some churches in Scandinavia and the Baltic states retained their bishops and episcopal polity, almost all the other Lutheran states abandoned the episcopacy. Instead, they had visitors, which were like our circuit visitors, superintendents, which were like our district presidents, and church councils or consistories, German is Kirchenrat there, which were like what we call a congregational church council or board of directors. But this pattern was not uniform, as there was a great variety of church polity throughout the many German and Central European states that were Lutheran. As early as 1528, Johannes Bugenhagen devised a modest church order for the city of Braunschweig that included laymen in a voting body, Wahlgremien, with a treasurer, a lay treasurer, I insist, and lay deacons, Kirchenvater. In 1569, the Duchy of Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel adopted a new and more complex church order or church council that included the Duke's chancellor, the Duke's deputy, a secretary, and the chief superintendent, who was the supervisor of all the clergy and congregations in the duchy. This church council included other appointed pastors, theologians, and laymen. Thus, the Lutherans in Germany had laymen serving in roles of ecclesiastical supervision, even before the Augsburg Confession. And this practice continues today to some extent. Martin Stefan, bishop. The LCMS had its origins in the person of Pastor Martin Stefan of Dresden in Saxony, Germany. The full story of Stefan and his immigration society is told in Walter Forster's classical book, Zion on the Mississippi. Stefan was ethnically an Austrian who spoke German, but he was born in Moravia, and his early religious education was in the Moravian Church. The Moravian Church was a product of the work of Jan Hus in Bohemia and of the Hussites that followed Hus's theology following his execution in 1415. Although rejecting the papacy and a good bit of Catholic theology, the Hussites and Moravians retained the office of bishop, just as the Anglicans would do in their Reformation. Stefan's Moravian roots had two important consequences for his later career. First, since the Catholic Habsburg rulers intended on getting rid of all Protestants, the Moravian religion was not tolerated in Bohemia or Moravia from 1624 to 1787. This forced Martin Stefan's parents to practice their religion in an underground church, underground not literally, but privately, which met secretly at night. This evening underground church was Stefan's religious experience until he became 10 years old, at which time the Moravian church was tolerated, and then its members could have normal church services. When Pastor Stefan later instigated secret evening services with his members in Dresden, he was reliving his childhood experience of covert religion in defiance of the established state church. Second, the Moravian church was governed by bishops, and it still is today. The power of these bishops were more limited than the Catholic bishops, but they retained the medieval privilege and powers of ordination. This meant that the pastors, under their supervision, were true subordinates. When Pastor Stefan later had the opportunity to start his own church among the Saxon immigrants that came to Missouri, he chose a form of government that was natural and instinctive for a Moravian. And this explains why the Saxon Immigration Society became episcopal in its church polity, once it was free from the authority of the Saxon state and its church officers. The great mystery is why Martin Stefan's clergy proteges, who were all Saxon Lutherans by birth and training and did not grow up with the episcopacy, why they agreed to Stefan's desire to become their bishop and overlord. The proteges who signed the episcopal investiture documents included 5 pastors, and we know these names from our history: Otto H. Walter, Gotthold H. Leber, Ernst G.W. Keil, Ernst Berger, and Karl Ferdinand Wilhelm Walther, as well as 8 candidates of theology: Emil Vegi, Gottlieb Krugel, Johann Gainer, Friedrich Freilich, Ottomer Furbringer, Karl Geyer, Georg Schifferdecker, and Theodor Julius Brome. The legal documents that were binding on the immigrants and the settlers had laymen involved in all areas of civil government and responsibilities. So we should not think that Stefan's authority extended to civil affairs. But Stefan became the colonists' supreme master in ecclesiastical affairs. The Saxons in Missouri after Stefan's departure. As most of you know, Bishop Martin Stefan was deposed on charges of secret sins of immorality, unfaithfulness, and hypocrisy, referring to adultery with at least 3 women. On May 30, 1839, he was unceremoniously shipped across the Mississippi River, leaving behind him a confused and restless group of Saxon Lutherans in the city of St. Louis and in Perry County, Missouri. The Saxons quickly divided into 2 grumbling factions, which disagreed not so much over the civil affairs of the immigrants, but over their church affairs and its governance. The settlement of the disagreements between these 2 factions created the church government that we have today in the LCMS, which is a modified form of congregational polity, sometimes called synodical-congregational polity. The full story of the creation of this church polity is explained in the classic book by Carl Mundinger, Government in the Missouri Synod. The lay faction was led by Dr. Carl Edward Vesey, Doctor of Laws, who had previously served the Saxon government as a curator of the Saxon archives. His closest allies were Franz Marbach, a lawyer, Heinrich Fischer, a merchant, and Gustav Jekyll, the treasurer of the Immigration Society. They also collaborated with Ferdinand Sprody, a baker, who saw his role as harassing the pastors into submission. The clergy faction was led by the pastors C.F.W. Walther, with his peers Ernst Keil and Gotthold Leber. Now we have 2 factions, and each has different perspectives. So Dr. Mundinger explains the perspective of Walther and the clergy faction in this way. I quote from Mundinger: "Should the clergy give up the control of the church to such unstable and inexperienced hot bloods as Vesey, Sprady, Fisher, and Jekyll? It is one thing to talk about the rights of the layman to take part in the government of the church. It is quite another to set up a government in which the laymen actually participate, or as the lay party wished, actually do the governing. Even Luther talked a great deal about the participation of laymen in the government of the church. But how much did he really do to put power into the hands of laymen? Over a period of 300 years, the Lutheran Church had developed a government in which the laymen were having less and less say. Would it be the part of wisdom and propriety that all government in the church should suddenly be turned over to men who had no experience and no tradition in governing? End of quote from Mundinger. So that's the clergy faction, their attitude and perspective. And what were the principles of church governance being advocated by the lay faction? The position of Weisse and the lay faction is found in their Protestationsschrift, that is, their public protestation document. We today would just call it a protest. Its subtitle, you get the sense of what they're saying here is in the subtitle, against the false, medieval, papistic, and sectarian Stephanistic system of church governance. This was a document that evolved from August 1839 until its final version of November 23, 1839. C.F.W. Walther later admitted that this document and its arguments were the principal influence in the Saxons' abandonment of the episcopal system set up by Stefan, and the principal influence in Walther's own doctrine of church and ministry. Here are samples of that document from November 1839. All I'm quoting directly from Mundinger, who translates them. And these are individual sentences that he pulls here and there from their writing. First, all Christians are priests through baptism by faith and must exercise the priestly office, not only as a matter of right, but as a matter of command. Number two, as spiritual priests, laymen have the right to judge all doctrine and to supervise all the activities of the clergy. 3, the final decision in all disputes rests with the local congregation. 4, the local congregation has the power and the duty to establish all rules regarding liturgy, ceremonies, and church constitutions. The next one, it's dangerous to judge people as to doctrine and as to their faithfulness over against established teachers. Equally dangerous is the habit of extolling clergymen as a class, den geistliche Stand, because such a habit engenders servility and hypocrisy. Next, the association of individual congregations is not necessary and may be harmful. Next, all pastors should be placed on the same level and exercise the same power. The episcopacy develops love of personal glory and leads to papacy. Next, in case of an emergency, a congregation may engage a man who has not studied. Next, men who have not studied, yes, ordinary laymen, may administer the sacraments. Finally, in judging clergymen, the chief stress, it is true, should be placed upon doctrine, but life, the fruits of doctrine, should not be overlooked. End of my quotes from Mundinger, who is quoting from the protest document. As Karl Mundinger observes, if the lay faction and all these principles had prevailed, the church polity of the LCMS would have been a, quote, this is what he says, highly individualistic congregationalism, somewhat akin to the polity of the Baptist Church in America, which decried all leadership on the part of the pastors. The lay faction did not prevail, partly because two of their chief leaders, Karl Weisse and Franz Marbach, returned to Germany. The lay faction did not prevail, but many of the principles that they derive, which I just quoted, from Scripture, Luther, and the Lutheran confessions, became a permanent part of LCMS congregations and the Synod in general. Now, the beginning of LCMS church polity. The historical narrative usually gets confused at this point because all the historians of the Saxon immigration moved from the public protestation in November 1839 to the Altenburg debate in April 15 and 21, 1841. That was, those you don't know, between Marbach and Walther. But the birth of the church polity, the LCMS type, occurred right in that period of a year and a half. And the evidence for it is now in English in the recently translated document called the Saxon Church Order. It's really the Missouri Synod's Saxons. It's our group. It's not the Lutherans in Germany. The Saxon Church Order of 1839 and 1840, translated by Pastor Charles Schaum. You can find it in the CPH paperback titled C.F.W. Walther, Churchman and Theologian, first published in 2011. The 1839-1840 Saxon Church Order contains all the elements of Walther's ecclesiology and includes specific regulations for the elections and duties of church officers and elders in the local parish. Although Walther's not indicated as being the author, the language and arguments are his. The subtitle of the church order explains its purpose, which states the relationship of the congregation, the pastor, and the congregation elders to each other. C.F.W. Walther was called in February 1841 to serve the Saxon congregation in St. Louis, which today is known as Trinity Lutheran Church in the Soulard Market neighborhood just south of downtown. His older brother Otto had been their first pastor, but he died in January 1841. The younger Walther arrived in April 1841, just after the Altenburg debate, and he began his life's work at Trinity Congregation. In writing about Walther's work at Trinity, Mundinger makes some excellent comments that explain how the principle of the supremacy of the congregation, which was advocated by the lay faction of Vasa and his allies, was counterbalanced by the German Lutheran understanding of the pastor. And this is a quote directly from Karl Mundinger from his book. Mundinger says, "For one thing, the congregation of Trinity St. Louis readily adopted the peculiarly Lutheran principle that when a congregation calls a pastor, then that pastor is placed over them by God and must be respected as God's servant and not the servant of men. Furthermore, the pastor was accorded respect and honor because the word which he preached was accepted as God's word. And finally, the congregation was definitely imbued with the characteristic Lutheran doctrine of the means of grace. That is, that through the word which the pastor preaches, faith is created in hearts in which there is no faith, and faith is strengthened in hearts in which it has already been created. Likewise, that through the administration of the sacraments, faith is created and strengthened. These purely Lutheran doctrines tended to give the minister a dignity which was unique." So far, Mundinger. Trinity St. Louis had begun its worship service and work without a written constitution in 1839. Besides a pastor, it had 4 elders and a treasurer, and they followed ad hoc instructions of the majority vote of the congregation. In August 1841, the congregation asked Pastor C.F.W. Walther to gather quotations from Martin Luther and Johann Gerhard that addressed the relationship of pastor to elders, and then read those quotations to the congregation at the next monthly meeting. This gathering and reading of witnesses, that is, authoritative statements from the fathers of the Lutheran Church, became the standard procedure by which Trinity adopted resolutions that pertained to church polity and governance. And they did it incrementally, almost at every one of their meetings. These resolutions then became the basis for its constitution, originally written by C.F.W. Walther and adopted in the spring of 1843. The 1843 Constitution of Trinity St. Louis became the pattern and model for hundreds of other Lutheran parishes, and it can be found today in English translation in C.S. Meyer's Moving Frontiers. Now, lest we think that Trinity Constitution of 1843 was devised entirely by a clergyman, that is, by their pastor C.F.W. Walther, Mundinger observes that Johann Katie Raymer, a saddler from Dresden, a guy that makes saddles, age 26, wrote up and read a paper titled Suggestions for the Election of Elders, and that was incorporated into the Constitution. J. Katie Raymer also suggested that a paragraph be inserted to the effect that no member of a secret society, such as the Freemasons, be permitted to become or remain a member of Trinity. Although this was not Walther's idea, it was accepted and later became a model lodge paragraph for LCMS congregations. So the lodge paragraph, if you got that in your constitution, came from J. Katie Raymer, who just happens to be the great-grandfather of somebody we know, Walter Disson. There's long connections in the Missouri Synod by family, as many of you know. The organization of the LCMS through the correspondence and meeting of old school Lutherans, such as C.F.W. Walther, Friedrich Winniken, Adam Ernst, and Wilhelm Seiler, has been well documented in our histories. Of particular interest for our topic today is the letter of August 21, 1845, from Walther to Ernst, in which Walther, speaking on behalf of the Missouri Saxons, expresses his chief desires for their synod. And I quote this. This is from Moving Frontiers. Walther says, what he wants for the synod is, number one, that the synod organize itself in addition to the Word of God on the basis of all the symbols of our church, and if possible, include also the Saxon visitation articles. However, I shall not unconditionally insist on the latter glorious, concise confession. There was an interest of Walther in visitation, which we talked about yesterday, that it be part of our structure and our supervision. Number two, I request that all syncretistic activity by synodical members be prohibited and banned by a special paragraph in the Constitution. Three, that the chief function of the synod be directed toward the maintenance and furtherance and guarding of the unity and purity of Lutheran doctrine. Four, that the synod should not be so much a plenipotentiary judiciary body, but much rather an advisory body to which a congregation in need of advice might have recourse. The synod must refrain especially from encroaching on the congregation's prerogative of calling a pastor. Five, I wish that the lay delegates, yes, everyone who is a member of synod, would have a seat and vote in the conventions the same as the clergymen. However, the chairman should be elected from among the clergy. Compare Acts 15:23. Number six, finally, I think that in no matter to be decided by synod should the right of appeal to the decision and vote of the individual congregations in fellowship be denied. End of quote. That's Walther. So the articles in our present Constitution, which you can find in the published handbook, which is also now online, correspond to Walther's letter in this way. Constitution Article 2 of our current Constitution presents Walther's first point about the binding role of Scripture in confessions. Article 6.2 in our Constitution presents Walther's second point about syncretistic activities. Article 3.1 presents Walther's third point about the chief function of synod in preserving the unity and purity of Lutheran doctrine. Article 7.1 presents Walther's fourth point about the advisory nature of the synod with respect to congregations. And Article 9.1 present Walther's fifth point about clergy and laymen having the same number of votes in conventions, that is, representational parity. Only Walther's sixth point, the right of appeal to all congregations of the synod in a type of plebiscite, was not taken up in the first or later constitutions of the synod. In terms of its basic synodical congregational structure and the 5 points urged by CFW Walther, the LCMS Constitution has been surprisingly consistent and coherent throughout the 174 years of the synod's existence, despite numerous changes to bylaws and amendments to the Constitution itself. CFW Walther's understanding of the biblical, confessional, and Orthodox Lutheran basis for this structure grew and developed with his years in office as pastor at Trinity, president of the Synod, and president of the St. Louis Seminary. In 1852, Walther published his first edition of Kirche und Amt, which means church and office, whose final edition under his direction was published in 1875. It is available in English with the title, quote, "The Church and the Office of the Ministry, the Voice of Our Church on the Question of Church and Office." It is still the best defense of LCMS synodical congregational structure, and it should be read in its entirety by all LCMS seminarians. And if you skip that in your seminary training, pastors, go back to it, please. Its theses should be studied by all LCMS laymen. You got some homework there to do if you haven't seen it before. And then if you're interested by what he says, go ahead and read the rest of it, LCMS layman, please. Now we get to changes in LCMS polity. How much time I have left here? I think I can make my time. Even though the polity of the LCMS has been generally consistent for 174 years, it has seen some gradual change. The accumulation of gradual changes over a period can result in major changes. I'm not the only member of the LCMS who believes that not all the changes have been good or have been consistent with our original principles of ecclesiastical supervision. Now, one obvious change, which I think everybody agrees was a good idea, maybe some of you don't think this was a good idea, was the transition from German to English during and after World War I. The Synod adopted a revised constitution in 1917 in which the word German was dropped from our name and the German language was abandoned as well. And that was a big cultural change. We won't go into that, but you got to realize it really did change who we are. At its 1962 convention in Cleveland, the LCMS considered the proposals of its Synodical Survey Commission, which had been authorized by the 1956 and 59 conventions. The commission intended to make the synod as efficient and economical as is humanly possible. That's a quote from the commission itself. Included in that purpose was the, quote, need to clarify the relationships of synods, districts, circuits, and congregations to each other, and, quote, the advisability of providing adequate job descriptions for various officers and officials, end of quote. Both of these purposes may have subtly changed the matter of ecclesiastical supervision. And we won't go into that because it's a very detailed study. But I think there were some changes there. In addition to specific recommendations to the 1962 convention, the commission also noted 9 items for further study, including, quote, that the entire adjudicatory process in synod be studied with a view to securing greater clarity, coverage, and service. This may involve adding adjudicatory functions to the Board of Appeals or in establishing a separate commission on adjudication. I should note here that the Board of Appeals was created in 1941, so that was the beginning of that sort of adjudication. It took 4 conventions, 65, 67, 69, and 71, for the Synod to figure out what it wanted to do with the 62 Synodical Survey Commission proposal regarding adjudication. But they finally got it done at the 1971 convention. Although it was not perfect, and nothing is perfect here on earth, it was the best system of adjudication the LCMS has seen. And that was partly because it observed the principle of lay-clergy parity that Walther had insisted on in his letter to Adam Ernst in 1845. How did we end up with something new in 92? In 1990, the president of the Synod was concerned about how the Robert Preuss case was going to be settled in the Synod's adjudication system. So he initiated and appointed the Task Force of Conflict Resolution. The task force brought to the 1992 convention a complete overhaul of the Synod's adjudication process, resulting in the, quote, dispute resolution system. This system, which abandoned the principle of clergy-lay parity, soon proved to be unworkable because it made no distinction between A, cases that were disputes and that could be reconciled, and B, cases that were actual disciplinary cases and that might involve expulsion from the Synod. This failing was corrected at the 2004 convention, along with other revisions to the adjudication process. A number of us over the years have written about the faults of the present adjudication system, and those faults are still in place. If you're interested in that, go to my endnotes. The last major change to Synod's system of ecclesiastical supervision occurred in 2010, with the adoption of almost all the proposals offered by the, quote, Blue Ribbon Task Force on Synod Structure and Governance. The most significant change was the abandonment of the former program board structure at the national level. The old program board structure meant that each board, for example, the Board for Mission Services, was constituted according to Walther's principle of lay clergy parity. In that system, that's the old system before 2010, each board appointed its own full-time executive and other professionals, and those appointed people were accountable to their board, half layman, half clergy, for all their works and decisions. All significant decisions were made by the board itself. In the new system of governance at the national level since 2010, there are only 2 boards, one for the domestic domain called the Board for National Mission, and the other for missions in the overseas domain called the Board for International Mission. And the only decision-making concerns of those boards is the making of policy and the setting of goals. The appointment, review, and termination of the executives and staff, plus the review of their work, is all done by the clergy guy called Chief Mission Officer, or CMO, who is himself appointed, reviewed, and terminated by the President of the Synod. So basically, everything that is actually done or accomplished by these offices and boards is now directly under the President of the Synod. And that is the significant and vast concentration of power over staff resources and decisions in the person of the synodical president. And by the way, President Harrison was against that, and he got elected, and he has to administer it. Now, whether you or not you think that this is a good idea, that is the 2010 structure, the obvious downside is that the layman and clergy board members do nothing but tinker with policy. Now, whose idea is that, or was that? Conclusions. The purpose of this paper was to present the history of ecclesiastical supervision in the LCMS, not to analyze various aspects of our current structure or to make new proposals. So I won't do that, but I'll make some concluding observations. At the congregational level, LCMS pastors really are supervisors, overseers, in that they're always the persons immediately and primarily responsible for the doctrinal orthodoxy of preaching, teaching, worship, administration of the sacraments, and pastoral care. Even though LCMS pastors have such supervisory authority and usually do most of that themselves, they're ultimately responsible to their congregation in the form of the voters' assembly. Such assemblies call their pastors and may, if necessary, terminate the call, though not arbitrarily and only after due process. This system, set up by Walther and Trinity St. Louis, is still valid today. But the system is challenged by a decline in respect for the office and the functions of word and sacrament. Pastors and preachers in America today are expected to be entertainers or television stars or Zoom stars during the COVID, or psychological motivators or psychologists or leaders, whatever that means. If congregations do not respect and support our pastors in the roles that are given to them by Christ our Lord, there is going to be trouble. And all the structure in the world will not solve that trouble. At the synodical level, one of my concerns since my ordination has been the decline of the authority of the layman at the circuit, district, and synod level in ecclesiastical supervision. In an age of so-called experts and paid consultants for everything, the lowly layman seems to be outgunned wherever he goes. In such an age, we always need to remember that everyone who is baptized is a member of the Christian priesthood, whether clergymen or laymen. Groups like the ACELC, the ACL, Brothers of John the Steadfast, and the LCA that educate and inform our laymen and clergy are very important in buttressing lay authority in our church and thereby supporting our synod and what it's all about and its work. Jesus said to his disciples, "You are not to be called rabbi, for you have only one master, and you are all brothers. Nor are you to be called teacher, for you have one teacher, the Christ. The greatest among you will be your servant." Matthew 23, 8-11. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Noland. And I know that you had mentioned on page 6 that this is something for another study. But one thing that I found very intriguing was in the 1956 and 59 conventions that the commission intended to, quote, make the synod as efficient and economical as is humanly possible. What that immediately reminded me of this paper that you may remember that Dr. Rast gave on P.E. Kretzmann probably 4 years ago or so, 5 years ago at Symposium, where he talked about how in these days, in the 50s or so, that efficiency was seen as a really big virtue. And is that something then that was playing a role in the kind of, and we see this today even where it's like, well, let's just keep moving, was this a shift where you would, because I've heard in the past that conventions, if there was a dispute on doctrine, they'd stop and they discuss it, and now we don't see that at all. Is this where we start seeing more of that shift at conventions?
That's a good question. It's a change of, would you say, synodical culture, what happens in conventions and conferences. And I've never really done a study on that. But the sociologists, not referring to church history, but in general, have talked about the cult of efficiency, which developed in the 1950s and 60s, and we're all products of that. I mean, you think about it, this was kind of, I was born in 56, and my mom and dad must have been pretty efficient to have me as a kid, as a child, but that's, you look at the advertisements and the cars, and streamlining was a big thing. You remember streamlining? Older folks might remember. So the cars in the 50s were streamlined to be less air friction, I guess. So the notion of streamlining has to do with efficiency. So it was like the whole culture, at least in America, was really all about that. And so I think people just thought, when we make changes, which is what's happening when you change the Constitution, you're simply making changes. And instead of saying this is a good reason, and what the reason is, you say it's efficient. Okay, and if it matches the culture of the day. So, typically in Western culture since the 18th century, there's been the notion of progress. So you can defend any change that you make in an institution or, say, in a community. That's progress. So I remember in the late 60s, Joni Mitchell had a phrase, they paved paradise and put in a parking lot. That's progress. Well, Paradise was a famous restaurant in part of LA. A lot of people loved it. Was had a garden area, and they took it down and put it in a parking lot. That's progress, right? So you have these city administrators, state officials that say, this is progress, and everybody who wants to be holding up progress, right? Well, that is the root of the notion of progressivism. And it goes back to Hegel philosophically, but in America, it's been a big thing. So what do they call the people today that are really for changing how we're doing government because of they're progressives, right? And so what are we? We're regressives, right? Missouri Synod, we're holding everything back. We're the dinosaurs. So I think there was some sense that maybe it didn't take over the synod, but it was part of the culture of the day, and it maybe influenced a lot of people. I do believe that we need to, now that the history of the American Lutheran Publicity Bureau has been published by Richard Johnson, and he was with them for years, so that's a great work that he's done for us. Now we have to look at that and say, to what extent was that doing the sort of thing with the Missouri Synod? Trying to push progressive ideals, whether from the culture or from other denominations, onto the Missouri Synod. And I think the ALPB is mostly to blame for that. And the last time I said that, I won't say it was a personal thing, but I got attacked. So I think I hit a nerve. So I think there is something there going on. I can say that I have not read through the entire, this survey commission was huge. It's in CHI, they got the binders, it's about this big on the shelf. They did a lot of research, and I think a lot of stuff was good, but the Synod didn't pass everything they recommended either. So the Synod did exert some of its necessary critical thought. But that's interesting that you picked that out, because that part, it's kind of a attitude change, that once you have this notion, we got to leave behind the old, well, now doctrine and all that, including the Book of Concord, and then the Bible itself starts getting left behind. So yeah, it's a theme to look for in our history as you read those writings or run into them. Say, is this being influenced by the cult of efficiency or progress? And I think it was.
So bottom page 7, you talk about the decline in respect for the office of word and sacrament, but then you also, on the next paragraph, talk about the decline of the authority of the layman.
Right.
How can that, how are both of those, it seems like a lot of our laymen kind of want to acquiesce, you do it, if they're delinquents, that's your job. If there's a call, that's your job. If there's a visitor, that's your, so is that our willingness to take on more responsibility than we should, an acquiescence on the part of our lay people? Those two don't seem like they should work together.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense, does it? So yeah, it's partly, so it's, did you say, what is an institution? An institution is a gathering of people, and they have a set form of rules. They may end up with some money and some property, and endures for a long period of time. That's the definition of an institution. And what you've just observed is institutional decline. So what was the original idea, and that we followed for a long time, both on the clergy and lay level, there's a decline in function, I think. That's my observation. So on the one hand, you have not the laymen that are here, because the laymen that are here are concerned, or they wouldn't be here. But the average layman has been, I think, entranced or enchanted by the preachers in the media. First by radio, which had a limited effect, but then by TV, which has had a great effect, and then by the evangelicals who are masters of the media. I mean, if you go to the Billy Graham Museum, which you should someday if you're in Wheaton, Illinois, you'll see how they used Billy Graham as a stage. It's not preaching to his congregation. It's a staged thing. And how they use that to manipulate what they wanted to accomplish. It's really kind of amazing and eye-opening. But we're all influenced by that. I remember in the 1970s, Billy Graham came through the Bay Area, and they filled the entire stadium, which was the Oakland Raiders stadium, I think. And so the culture, in terms of its understanding of Christianity, with all that media stuff, has shifted from where it used to be the priest and his congregation and the pastor and his congregation to this bigger thing. And so those of us that are simply serving as the average parish pastor, they say, well, who are you? I think there's a bit of that that's going on. So there's a decline in that part of it, but there's also, as you pointed out, there's a decline on the lay level, whether they're interested or not. I don't think, sometimes I think maybe it's more where one of the sociologists has talked about there's a decline across the United States in all types of associations. So Elks Club, Freemasons, which are, all those type of things. Boy Scouts, the participation, even though population has gone up, participation has declined. And the same thing is happening in the churches of all sorts, not just Missouri Synod. And so when you have a church body like ours that's dependent on lay participation, and not just giving money, but actual volunteer work and competent leadership, when you have decline in that, that's going to affect us too. So I think it's really both. It's not because it's one played off against the other. It's and give thanks to God for the loyal laymen that are actually doing the work in our congregations. Because if we didn't have them, we would be sunk. Absolutely sunk. Because I can't do it myself. But the thing is, I think the Missouri Synod's growth period happened when the laymen had been well trained by their institutions in our church, including our parochial schools primarily, and they came out and knew what they needed to do, and they dedicated themselves to that. And I think most of you here have been involved with that, or you wouldn't be here. But the percentage in the congregations, it's my perception, it's not scientific. I think that has gone down. So I think we need to rejuvenate that and work on it. And I remember Gene White, one of my friends that would always come here to ACLC, he had a program or something called Church Matters, where his whole concern was educating laymen so they could become better assistants in the work of the church and not putting everything off on experts. Really, in some sense, pastors we're kind of muddling around too. The Bible is a bottomless pit of stuff to study and to try to figure out. So what am I supposed to preach to you? And so I try to read through the Bible and do the best I can, but I'm not an expert. I'm just a guy that's doing his job. So I think that all of us, pastors, need professional, regular education, which we get through our pastors' conferences. So pastors, don't skip those. And laymen, you need your education too, whatever your area of work, so you can do a better job of that. And our type of church polity depends on it, because if our laymen give it all up to the pastors, it's going to change what we are. I don't know if that really answers you, but that's my feeling on it anyway.
Thank you, Dr. Noland. Could you connect much of what you just said as it relates to what seems to have happened at each of the most recent synodical conventions, where you have the synod coming together with that equal representation between clergy and lay, and yet when it comes to significant doctrinal issues, including the topic of ecclesiastical supervision, it's basically punted to the COP. And I want to know, how does that connect to what you just said, and kind of when did that start?
Well, did you finish your question? Yes. Okay. So I haven't been to the last conventions, and the last workbook was huge. I started reading through it and just gave up on it. I did read through the proceedings, so I'm not sure what happened at the convention itself. So that's my ignorance. But the custom of the synod has been that things that we have already decided and talked about a lot, and we came to some settlement of the issues, that those go to A, B, and C. Do you remember whatever that is? And I think that's what you're talking about, the omnibus resolutions. So I'm not sure exactly which proposal you're talking about, but the other side of it is the responsibility of the chairman. Anybody that served as a chairman in the congregation, chairing of let's say a voters' assembly, chairman of the district convention, chairman of the president, is that you have enough time to consider the most significant resolutions that come before the body. And that's always it's a difficult to make, because the way we have it is we have tons of, that's, if you measure the books, it is tons of material. And so how are we going to cover all that, and who's going to make that decision? Well, the way the synod has decided over the years is that, unless I'm wrong about this, you can correct me, those of you who know the bylaws, that the president of the synod, of the next convention, he appoints the floor committees, right? Is that correct? And then the floor committees are divided into various sections, and they get all the stuff that comes from the congregations, and they have to decide what's going to be important. And so, they talk among themselves, and that's mixed. That is lay clergy parity, by the way. I think it's still 50-50 there. And so lay and clergy keep talking back and forth, and they say, these are the ones we think are most important. They're causing the most trouble. We need to settle that now, not put it off. So the ones that seem to be the most trouble are the ones you're likely to come to the convention first from that floor committee. It's not the president manipulating. It's his group of people, but he usually tries to get a representative group of people in there. And so the idea is not that really the purpose of the convention is to settle issues and to not keep bringing them up over and over again. So the floor committee says, let's deal with these ones that are really bothering us right now as a synod. And those come to the front. And the ones that they have think that they've already dealt with. And they maybe don't understand what you said in the resolution. But they're thinking, well, these are the most troublesome. That's the ones, and that may be all that they have time for. Because you're not going to have, I remember my first convention, after the president was elected, I saw somebody I knew, and he was packing his bags. And I said, where are you going? He said, it was like the second or third day, the president was elected. He said, I'm going home. I said, what? The convention is still another 3 or 4 days here. We got a lot of important business and people to elect. He said, I elected the president. It's all I got to do. I said, no, you got to stay for the whole thing. I didn't convince him, of course. So there's a lot of stuff but people are not going to stay longer than a week. As it is, it's exhausting. So it's a limited amount of time. So I would say is if you didn't get what you wanted done, I'm not saying you, but whoever put that resolution in, take it back to your group of friends and say, well, it just didn't get addressed. So let's rewrite it so the real issue is right up in front. So everybody knows what the real problem is. Because if you make it too long, the floor committees will miss the point. So that's just some experience of working with floor committees and trying to get some resolutions through. I don't know the merits of that particular resolution, so I'm not speaking to that. So I'll have to look it up and see. But I'd say keep working on it. I mean, because there are things that sometimes the people that get appointed to these, they don't know everything that's going on in the synod, and they can't always see down the road. And sometimes the average guy in the pew is the one that can see down the road better than anybody else. So keep working on it and don't give up on it.
Thank you. Always learn tremendous amount when you present, Doctor. So President Bowman invested a large amount of time and energy in the mission blueprint for the 90s. Mm-hmm. Many of those things in the mission blueprint were voted on and accepted, mm-hmm. and President Bowman was defeated. President Kieschnick spent a lot of time and a lot of energy with the Blue Ribbon Task Force and all of its various shades, and many of those things were passed and adopted, and President Kieschnick was defeated. What does this say about our synod? And maybe we're schizophrenic, I don't know. But, I was reminded of that when President Snow said, how can both of these things be true here? Is that kind of the nature of fallen men, that we like a good idea, but we don't trust a particular person with too much power? Or is there something bigger? You're a student of this history. Do you see any patterns, or what does this mean?
Well, there is a thing that political scientists talk about political capital. So you have a certain amount of that once you're and this is not referring to the pastor because it's a different office, but our positions, because we have democratic polity, depend on reputation and how people size you up as a leader and stuff. And that's kind of your political capital. And so then they say that once you're in office, you have so much that you can spend. So what are you going to spend it on? And I'm talking politics here because that's what you're asking. So I think certainly every synodical president, maybe not so much the district presidents, has to figure out, what am I going to spend my couple years in office in? Unlike, you shouldn't plan to be a John W. Bacon, who was probably president of the synod for half of his life, it seems like. He was, 40 plus years, I think. It was kind of amazing. That's not generally the way we have worked. I mean, even in the early years, it was a couple of terms and then you're out. It's exhausting work, for one. But the question is, why did those cases, this big program get passed, but the leader did not get passed or was not accepted? Well, it could be that he spent all of his political capital on that project and thereby had alienated by working on that project so much that he wasn't reelected. That's a possibility. Another is he spent so much time on that he was neglecting bigger issues, the bigger issues of ecclesiastical supervision. And for the synodical president, as we currently have it, part of it is his work with the Council of Presidents. Not the council per se, but with the individual district presidents, because they're his representatives to the district. And he is the embodiment, if you want, maybe that's not a good word, but he represents the Missouri Synod to outside church bodies. So the people in Lafayette want to know, well, what is Missouri Synod doing, and thinking the first person they talk to is Matt Harrison or his associate that's in that office. They don't come to talk to me or to Rolf Preuss. Now, if they're Norwegian, they might talk to Rolf Preuss, but they generally don't do that. So what is the president of the synod supposed to be doing? And part of it is his representatives, who are the Council of Presidents, the members of the council, that he's in regular communication with them and dealing with the issues they have to deal with, because they have to deal with the individual congregations and pastors, and they know what's going on, don't you? Absolutely. He can't tell you, but he knows what's going on.
Knows way more than I do.
Oh, I see. Okay. Did you hear that? You can quote him today, the date, 11:15 a.m. He says, you know more than he does. But, so they're kind of on the front line in terms of the synod's work. And so if the synod president is neglecting that, it's going to come back to haunt him. And there are other areas that he supervises directly or indirectly, like the seminaries and the colleges and the missions. So, for example, Pfotenhauer got unelected because he was involved with the Brooks case. Now, the problem is that the synod at the time forced him to do that. That was in the bylaws, and he had to do it. But the Brooks case was really messy, and Adolf Brooks wrote a letter to all the congregations of the synod and said that the missions secretary and Pfotenhauer were a bunch of jerks, and you should unelect them. And they did. That's how Bacon got into office. So there's all sorts of areas where the synod president can be attacked from and the problem is if he works too much on one project, he's going to be neglecting those other areas. That's my analysis as a theologian, or as a historian. But I don't envy the job. I think it's, practically speaking, it's an impossible job. So you have to do the best you can, and you have to prioritize and take what comes. You have to admit that, so for example, I'm from California, and right now everybody hates Gavin Newsom, and they have a recall in November. Well, this would not be the case. It's not that they hate him because he is Nancy Pelosi's nephew, which he is. Did you know that? Oh, yeah. Well, that's how he got elected. So why do they hate Gavin Newsom? He's a nice-looking guy, and he talks well, and he does things that Californians like, not all of us, but it's because of COVID. Who could have predicted COVID? And he felt that he had to lock down the whole state, which he did. So nobody likes him because of COVID. Who could have predicted that? So things like this happen to Missouri Synod presidents, too. Now, I think some of them shoot themselves in the head. But I won't say who and when that's when I write a book, someday. But it's hard. It's easy to criticize, but I'm trying to think, what would I do in their situation? I've got limited attention and limited knowledge too. And if God gave me the wisdom of St. Paul, I wouldn't be here. Where would I be? I'm just one of the normal parish pastors that's doing his job. And really, the synodical president is the same thing. It's just we give them a whole lot more work.